presentation and the discussion panel ending at 2:30. Those who arrive 15 minutes late will not receive credit. Participants must stay for the full length of the workshop in order to receive credit. If you have questions, please email Faculty Success at faculty.success@unt.edu. This event will also be available on the Diversity and Inclusion YouTube channel. We are pleased Dr. Robeson is spending the day with us at UNT. Dr. John Elder Robeson is the Neurodiversity Scholar in Residence at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and one of the founders of the Neurodiversity program at the school, one of the first of its kind at a major American university. He teaches neurodiversity at the Williamsburg campus and at the Washington, D.C. Continuing Ed facility. He is an active participant in the ongoing discussion of ethical and legal issues related to autism therapy, services, and intervention. He is particularly interested in improving quality of life for those people living with autism today, both autistic people and family members. He's been a member of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and he serves on other boards for the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and private organizations. He's also a professor of practice in the Department of Education at Bay Path University in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, and the co-founder of the TCS Auto Program, a special ed high school program for teens with developmental challenges in Springfield, Massachusetts. In his younger days, Robeson worked as an engineer for Kiss and Pink Floyd Sound Company and worked on original electronic games at Milton Bradley. Later on, he founded J.E. Robeson Service, a restorer of Land Rover, Rolls-Royce, and Mercedes motor cars. Robeson's book, Switched On, A Memoir of Brain Change and Emotional Intelligence, Look Me in the Eye, Be Different, and Raising Cubby are the most widely read accounts of life with Asperger's in the world. His books have been translated into more than 15 languages, and they are sold in 60 plus countries. Robeson has authored or contributed to over 100 autism-related articles. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. John Elder Robeson.
Well, thank you for your kindly introduction and for welcoming me back to Texas. You know, after my first book, Look Me in the Eye, came out, your state adopted it as a special ed reader, and I got to see the entirety of the huge state of Texas, traveling from one education service region to another, talking about autism and difference. There's just one thing in your introduction that I would point out. I'm not actually Dr. Robeson. I am, to the best of my knowledge, one of the only self-educated people teaching in the sciences at an American university. I actually do not have any college degree, even though I teach in college and even though I serve on guiding boards for our government for public health policy and World Health Organization for autism definition. At one time, it was ordinary for people to fill roles such as mine from a background of self-education. Today, with the rise of big universities, it's all but unheard of. However, I hope that that's going to change with the rise of diversity and inclusion efforts on college campuses and neurodiversity initiatives both in college and in the workplace. However, all that was pretty far in the future when I was a little boy. I didn't know anything about autism, didn't know anything about neurodiversity. All I knew was that I was the kid that people didn't choose to be friends with. I was the one who didn't get chosen for softball. I always said the wrong thing. You know, I'd drop something and my mother's friend would say, well, that's great, look what you've done. and I wouldn't know how to respond. And I'd say I could break another one. And as you can imagine, she would launch after me and I would have to run and hide. And, you know, it's easy to look back on things like that today and think they're funny, but if you're 5 years old getting chased by this giant monster when you didn't really know what you did wrong, it's really not a good way to live. I got into school and I did okay until I got into junior high school, when they wanted me to do a lot of things that didn't make sense to me. I tried to point out the errors to my teachers, who responded by giving me Fs. I truly did my best to pass courses like English and mathematics, but I couldn't do it. And ultimately, I dropped out of school. I was very fortunate, though, that I had developed an interest in music and electronics, and I had a real love for those things. And I was also lucky to live in a college town where my parents were professors, and they had brought me to the labs in the engineering building and set me loose among the grad students. And in the basement of Engineering East at the University of Massachusetts, I spent thousands of hours when other people were going through high school or going through college, tinkering with electronic circuits. First, I destroyed everything I touched, and then I could take things apart, and then eventually I could fix things. And finally, I got to the point where I was actually able to create new things. And since my interest was music, focused on creating sound effects, changing the sounds of, of musical instruments. And even though I was rejected by kids in school, I was welcomed with open arms by the community of musicians. And you know, among the musicians, it was like we were all freaks together. We were like freaks against the world. And I was just so proud when I would see things that I had fixed or things that I had built go up on stage and see the audience applaud. I worked on bigger and bigger systems for bigger and bigger bands. In the introduction, you heard that I was hired in the mid-'70s by Britannia Row, Pink Floyd's sound company, when they wanted to set up an operation in the United States. And I helped repair and build equipment for many, many bands playing, you know, British invasion music and metal music and blues and disco and all kinds of music. And I was so lucky to be able to tour all over North America, you know, seeing the systems run. And ultimately, one day we took a job building a system for KISS. And they asked me if I could create guitars that would blow fire and ultimately that would light up and shoot rockets. And those things probably became the musical instruments that I was best known for, even though I was most proud of the sound effects and the sound reinforcement equipment that I built that was behind the scenes, and yet it delivered sound for millions and millions of people in those years. After doing that a while, though, I decided I wanted a regular job. And I took a job, as you heard, designing some of the first sound effects in electronic games and toys. And I worked on some of the first electronic games that used digital speech synthesis. And I did okay in those jobs, but I couldn't help escape the feeling that I was a second-rate person. You know, I had always been the kid no one wanted, and music kind of took me away from that. But when I was back in the when I was in the corporate world, I was once again in the position of not understanding the social dynamics, being around a lot of people that thought I was weird and probably undesirable, and I couldn't read what they wanted. I couldn't tell what was expected of me. And I thought, well, I'm not even a real engineer. and maybe I need to just quit this and do something else. And after bouncing around a few other jobs in corporate electronics, I left and I started a business fixing automobiles. I thought, well, I had dropped out of school. I really didn't have any credentials, and I felt like a fraud working in these big engineering companies. But I thought, who's going to care where I came from, putting a water pump on a car or tuning an engine? And that proved to be the case. And it also turned out that the same gifts I had for seeing into electronic circuits and seeing into music and how the sounds are created, that allowed me to see into automobiles and how to solve complex problems with them. And it made ultimately the business successful. Even though I did not have a lot of bedside manner, if you would, I didn't always know what to say to people. The results spoke for themselves. And my car business got steadily bigger, to the point that after a little while, I found myself sitting in the office, answering the phone, writing up work orders, talking to customers who waited for their cars. And I had a couple of guys working in the shop, which was growing rapidly. And one day, a customer had been sitting in the shop who was a therapist, and I'd gotten to know him over a few years. He said to me, "John, I wouldn't even say anything to you about this, but you have told me on so many occasions how you don't know what to say to people. And, once you said to me, you feel like you're standing outside in the rain, looking in the window at a bunch of people standing around laughing and talking around a warm fire, and you don't know how to get on the inside." And he said, "I've seen you have arguments and troubles with customers that you didn't really need to be arguing with. And you've always said to me, I don't understand, what's gone wrong." And he said, "There's this condition they're talking about in the mental health world that really explains what has happened to you. And it's called Asperger syndrome. It's a form of autism, and you could be a poster boy for it." I was kind of stunned, and I said, "Well, what's that?" And he actually had a book. It was Tony Attwood's book, Asperger Syndrome, which had just been published at the time. And he handed it to me, and he said, "Look, right here," he said, "people with autism, they don't understand personal space. You get too close to people and they feel threatened. You turn away when someone's talking and they feel that you're disrespecting them by ignoring them. People with Asperger's don't understand body language and facial expressions." And then he turned to another section. He said, "Look here, people with Asperger's are often fascinated by transportation machinery, trains, airplanes, automobiles, and they can become formidable experts in those areas." And it seemed like everywhere I looked in that book, it was me. And ultimately, I decided that I was going to take the knowledge in that book of Tony Attwood's, and I was going to teach myself how to act so as not to have so much trouble with people. I taught myself to hold out an imaginary hand like this and to say, I won't get more than 2 arm's lengths from you when I'm talking, so that I won't be like right in your face like this and make you feel threatened. And I taught myself that I won't turn away like this to make you think that I'm actually paying attention to something else and what you're saying doesn't matter. I taught myself 1,000 little things like that that didn't involve me learning to do things I couldn't do, but I taught myself how to do those things. And it made a magical difference in my life. All of a sudden, people wanted to be my friend. They wanted me to do things with them. And ultimately, I decided to write a book to share the story of my midlife success, because I knew there were millions of young people growing up with autism and other, differences like mine. And I thought, well, they must be having a lousy early life too, just like I did. And I wanted to show them that, you can leave that behind. You can, even if you drop out of school, you can start a business, you can make a success of yourself, you can become accepted in the community. You can do all these things that I thought I could never do. And look me in the eye, just took off beyond any expectation that I could have had. One result of it was that I was invited to take part in neuroscience experiments at autism research facilities. And in one of those experiments, they did a battery of cognitive tests on me. And they showed me how in some areas, like recognizing facial expressions, my ability was in the first or second or fifth percentile. My ability was at the absolute bottom of the barrel. But then when they looked at other areas, like my ability to see patterns that were hidden inside things, or to solve puzzles, to manipulate waves in my mind, or to use language in complex ways, I was in the 99th percentile for those things. So it seemed like I was a person of contrasts. There wasn't much about me that was in the middle. I was either at the top or I was at the bottom. And all my life, people had told me about every single thing I did that was at the bottom. Nobody had told me about things I did that were at the top. I had always assumed that even when I found success as an engineer, when I designed equipment and my sound systems went into Madison Square Garden and thousands of people stood up and cheered, or when somebody like Ace Frehley brought one of my guitars on stage and the audience roared when they saw the lights and the smoke come out of it. And I was so proud of that, but I always tempered that with the thought that, if I could have done that, a real engineer could have done it better. And the only reason I'm here doing it is that this music stuff is just too unimportant for a real engineer to do. And I rationalized away my success at Milton Bradley and all the other places I worked in exactly the same way. And of course, now I can look back on that. I can think, that was some of the most popular music of all time. And those toys that we developed at Milton Bradley, they sold millions and millions of them. And people still talk about them in online communities today. And of course, they were tremendously successful. And anyone could be proud to be engineering those kinds of things. But I always felt like I was a second-class person, not really a good, real anything. And it was only really after meeting with those folks at Harvard Medical School and their Beth Israel Hospital that I finally understood that autism conferred upon me some real disabilities, but it also conferred upon me some really wonderful exceptionalities. And even though autism was the source of tremendous pain and suffering in my life, it was also the source of the creative visualization that allowed me to do all the things that made me a successful adult. And it was only after doing that I understood this fundamental concept of the thing that we now call neurodiversity. And that is that even though my brain may be different from some of your brains, and even though I may look at you blankly when you expect me to say, can't you see that I'm hurting, or can't you see that I'm happy? No, I can't see those things. But you know what? I can see inside sound systems, and I can see inside car engines. And I now know that most people can't do those things. And what I now know that's most important for me and for all of you is that people like me are not broken versions of someone else's normal. We are complete, correct humans in our own right. That is the wonder of this thing we call neurodiversity. Words like autism, Asperger's, ADHD, PDD, NOS, dyslexia, Tourette's, those are descriptive terms for disabilities that doctors use to describe us when we can't do certain things. But we are individuals, complete, correct people, as I said, and we are more than packages of disabilities. So, in our community, we are embracing the idea of neurological diversity. I'm not here because somebody dropped me on my head as a baby. I'm here because people like me with different brains have been born throughout human history, and we are here because we serve an evolutionary purpose. We drive society forward in small numbers. Yes, we're disabled, but we also bring gifts to the world. And that is a very, very different perspective than the perspective that we have traditionally seen from the medical community. And that's why I encourage framing the discussion in our terms, neurodiversity, which is a term of empowerment instead of autism, ADHD, etc., which are terms of disability. So if there's one message that I'm here to share with you today, it is that the disability in neurodiversity is absolutely real. It's very painful. For some of us, it's extremely disabling. For others, it's mildly disabling. Some of us are visibly physically disabled. Others, you can't see the disability, but it's still there. But in every case, we have the same human rights, the same right to dignity and respect as everyone. We are complete, correct people, however we are. And that is my message for you. And I guess now, is it Shani that I'm going to do a Q&A with, or somebody else that we're going to do a moderated discussion?
Yes, it is Shani, and your timing is impeccable because you stopped right when we were supposed to stop. So I love when things go this way. So thank you so much for sharing your story. I was just chatting with someone that, you know, it's so inspiring, particularly I'm thinking of so many of the folks that I know who have either children who are neurodiverse or friends or partners that are neurodiverse. I think what you just said about the strengths of neurodivergent people is really, really inspiring. So thank you for that. I actually want to start with some more of those strengths, right? You touched on some of them, but what are some of the, broadly speaking, the potential strengths of neurodivergent people, particularly in a higher education setting? Because, you know, we have a lot of conversations about supporting students, but what are the strengths of our neurodiverse faculty and staff?
Well, first of all, I think we should put neurodivergent people in their proper context. Neurodiversity is the idea that neurological diversity exists just as other kinds of human diversity exist. People who are generally in the mid-range in terms of neurological function might be called neurotypical. People whose abilities or function are at closer to the edges are called neurodivergent. There comes a point where being neurodivergent shades into being seriously disabled. And that, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. So one person might look not disabled and he might say, this is a horrible disability, it sucks, I hate it. And another person might seem to you very disabled and say, hey, I'm a neurodivergent person and I want to be a full contributor to this team, and I'll thank you to just, not say anything more about it. And the number of neurodivergent people is very large. Our CDC, when they survey folks, or when they survey kids in school, which is the place that we have the best ability to survey this, they find that the population of kids who can be diagnosed with autism spectrum conditions, ADHD, OCD, and related conditions, dyslexia, Tourette's, that group represents 12 to 15% of the population of any public school. Those are all inborn neurological differences. So even though they may not be disabling to people in high school, college, or adulthood, those people still have those differences. It's significant to note that the population of neurodivergent people as a group, which include people of both sexes, all races, all faiths, is larger than, say, the African American or Latin population in America. It is one of the biggest minorities in this country. So that means that in your university and in every workplace, the neurodivergent people aren't just the students. They're not people we're going to go recruit. They're us. They're all out. We are all out there. I think that when you ask what do neurodivergent people do that is important at a college, much of what we do that makes us stars in college or in any other workplace is building upon traits that disabled us as little boys and little girls. So when we were in school, some of us had fixations on things. And part of neurodiversity is that for many of us, when we get fixated, we get really fixated. And all we do is that thing. Now, maybe that thing is Pokemon, or it's Beanie Babies, or it's some kind of trading card, or maybe it's cockroaches, and you might think, what's disgusting? Cockroaches, all he wants is cockroaches. And if you're trying to get, a 5-year-old to go to school, or you're trying to get a 12-year-old to go to math class or go to social studies, all he cares about is cockroaches, that's a really big disability. But when that person is an insect scientist in your college, and that person knows more about locusts than anyone else in the world, that person is a really, really valuable fellow or gal or fellow for you. And then they're going to be really, really valuable in industry. So by growing up and transferring those childhood fixations to adult dreams and visions, the disability trait becomes a trait that makes us a star. In my second book, Be Different, I actually took all the traits of disability in the DSM, the manual psychiatrists use to describe us. I took those things and I described how they affected me in my life. And in almost every case, I found that I could tell you stories of either childhood disability, or, for example, the idea that there are always trade-offs. So I might not be able to look in your eyes and say, oh, that's a sweet thought, or you're sad, or you're happy, or you're jealous. I might not know those things, but I can look into a piece of machinery and I can see when something's going wrong in the machine. And you, who could look in my eyes, you could see what I'm thinking, but you can't see a thing in that machine. And there are other people, like Temple Grandin, for example. Temple can't look in your eyes and read your thoughts either, but Temple can look into the eyes of a cow, and she can look into the eyes of a cat and a horse. And she has this amazing ability to, again, see things other people cannot. And yet, there is an offsetting disability. And I think that's what happens when your cognitive function is significantly different from the norm. You might be an incredible genius in mathematics, but you can't ever remember to button your shirt straight or put on matching socks. And so it's reasonable to think that if you're 10 years old, that's really frustrating. But if you're 40 years old and you're the most brilliant person in the math department, then, well, that professor, he just, you just ignore how he dresses. Sometimes he never brushes his hair, sometimes he puts his socks on, but he's really, really smart. And that's the thing, that society learns to accommodate that. So if you ask, what would we do in a college? I think we can best accommodate neurodiversity by being more accepting and accommodating, not only of different looking people, but different behaving people. Your diversity programs have taught, I think, through very clear, firm statements, that the color of someone's skin, whether they are heavy, whether they are skinny, whether they wear a dress that indicates that they are Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist, that you absolutely cannot treat somebody differently because of those clues as to their differences. So that's diversity in other areas. The thing that's challenging about neurodiversity is we don't necessarily have a clue to how we're different in any other way. And indeed, we could be any of those ways. And yet we might say something that you think is really weird or inappropriate or rude because of our difference, because we don't see the world the way other people do. So it calls for a new level of compassion and understanding. And it's not so obvious because we don't look different. And that's, I think, the real challenge. But there is also a huge opportunity.
So this is kind of related to that. You talked about, we talk a lot about intentional inclusion here at UNT, and how to make things more inclusive and equitable through policies, programs, practices, and people. So what are some steps for people to take or things for people to do in order to respect and acknowledge and affirm, really, students and colleagues who are neurodivergent? And really, it's what might intentional inclusion look like? You're saying that, we have clear policies about lots of other types of identities, but what does intentional inclusion look like for students and employees who are neurodivergent?
Well, one thing that it looks like is it looks like having leaders come out on campus. You, for example, you raise your hand and you say, I am proud to identify as neurodivergent. And I think that that's exactly what schools and workplaces need. They need people who are in leadership, older people, not just freshman students coming in to say, hey, look here, I am neurodivergent, I am like you. Just as there are people on campus, there are gay professors, there are professors, they're gay, trans, there's professors that follow different religious faiths. Obviously there are people of different races. And all that diversity is there for everyone to see, but you can't see neurodiversity, so people have to say it. And I think that not only do they have to say it, but the college has to say it right from the top. I suggest that the college should make neurodiversity something that stands perhaps in the president's office of diversity. It's something that the president says, we embrace all forms of diversity in this institution, and neurodiversity is not only one of them, but it is a big one, because neurodivergent people are members of all of the other diversity groups on campus. And I think actually, of course, many groups of many diversities are interwoven.
Sure. Yeah, we talk a lot about those intersected identities.
Yep.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. That was actually one of the reasons I chose to quote unquote come out as someone who's neurodivergent, because it is, there's a stigma often attached to that, particularly in some communities of color and in some other cultures. So this is another question kind of related to that stigma. In addition to coming out, if you will, and saying, I am neurodiverse, you can't see it, you might not be able to tell from looking at me, but yes, I am. How can we support, bring awareness to, and decrease the stigma surrounding neurodiversity, and what type of climate needs to exist? We talked about intentional inclusion, but what does the climate need to look and feel like to decrease the stigma?
I think the stigma comes from the medical labels that we have used to describe neurodiversity for almost 100 years now. Before we had labels, autism, ADHD, and so on, people like us were just different. And it's true that we were often marginalized and even cruelly treated by children in childhood, but we didn't grow up under a cloud. When we were adults, kind of left that behind. But when you are diagnosed with autism, you've been told what's wrong with you. And this label for what's wrong with you follows you all through life. And I think that that's really a fundamental problem. If you say to somebody that you meet at a party, oh, my daughter just got diagnosed with autism, the other person says, oh my, I'm so sorry. But if you say, my daughter's neurodivergent and she's going to be going to whatever, college next year. They say, really? Wow, what's neurodivergent? And so I think that when I stressed that neurodiversity, neurodivergent, those are our words in the community. Our words don't carry stigma, because our words, when somebody says, what's neurodivergent? Well, I'm a person who's got some social disabilities, but I've got some technical gifts. And that's because my brain works differently. And so people with non-standard brains are called neurodivergent. And so when you present it in that light, nobody would apologize for that. You've got these gifts, you're going off to do this thing, but there are some offsetting disabilities.
How new is that term, John? Because I was just diagnosed with ADHD in the last 5 years, and it made all the difference to me because I now know why I'm this way, right?
Yeah.
But I did not know the term, and I'm a diversity and inclusion practitioner. I didn't know the term existed until I started working with the Neurodiversity Professional Network. So how long has this term been around, and how do we increase awareness of the term?
Well, I think that neurodiversity is the latest form of diversity for us to confront as a society. So it's probably fair to say that many or most of the terms embraced by people in the African American diversity community have only existed since the advent of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Before that, there were just derogatory terms. And I think that if we go from there, if we go to what was a gay rights movement and then an LGBTQ movement and so on, once again, you had kind of hateful, nasty names, and they've been replaced by the community's terms of choice. And even before African American civil rights, you had women's rights movement, and you had women, getting the vote, and suffrage movement that dates back even further. And in each case, the terminology the preferred terminology was defined by the group. And so it was the medical profession that we can credit for defining us as a group by picking out the ways we're disabled. They didn't happen to see the ways we're gifted, but nonetheless, they identified us as a group. And we, just as just as people in those other groups said, we are not the thing that all those haters called us.
Right.
We are whatever, for our respective groups.
Right.
We are saying the very same thing. We are more than autism. We are more than a package of disabilities. So the reason that you didn't hear about it is it wasn't on your radar, and it wasn't on anyone's radar 10 years ago. When I was diagnosed with autism, neurodiversity just wasn't a thing. It was a word that had appeared in a few publications 20 years ago, but no one knew it. Mm-hmm. And I think that even 10 years ago, even today, frankly, a distressing number of people call each other things like retards and other ugly names, right? And that has turned out like an N-word, right? That I can say it because I am one of those people who was called that, but other people who are not cannot. And we are the ones speaking out strongly against that. And sometimes I think we're speaking out against the neurological equivalent of racism and hatred. Mm-hmm. And other times, I think a great deal of the time, we are speaking out against relatively innocent ignorance. Mm-hmm. But whether it's ignorance or hatred, the result is the same. We don't want people calling us those names. We want full inclusion in society. We want recognition as deserving of the same respect and accommodation as anyone else.
Yeah.
And then that might take us to, okay, what about those accommodations? We're a college and we've got students saying, I need more time for tests. I need to be in an environment where there's natural light. I can't be under fluorescent lights. I can't work on a hard floor because it's echoey and harsh and it jars my mind. And so there are some professors who think, why do we have to accommodate all these things? I got through school like that. Mm-hmm. Sure, maybe you did get through school like that. Maybe your colleagues got through school like that. Do you think it makes it better? Do you think just because you toughed it out, because you would have been thrown out on your ass, means everybody else should do it? The fact is, every single one of us will do better if we are studying or working or whatever else we do under natural light, warm temperatures and sunny skies. Who wouldn't want to be like that? Who in his right mind would want to spend his days on a concrete or linoleum floor with cinder block walls? The answer is nobody. Nobody would want to sit in hard, uncomfortable school chairs. Nobody would want to be pressed to complete an English test in 30 minutes or fail. When in fact, everyone who takes those tests knows that in the real world, no one cares one little bit about those things. All they care about is, can I deliver the results? So I think there's two takeaways. One is that in almost every single case, an accommodation that a neurodivergent person asks for to relieve the impact of disability is something that every single person, student, faculty, and staff alike, will benefit from in a school or workplace. And the second thing is that schools need to change in order to teach people how to deliver the results that employers want. Just as you have a neurodiversity in the workplace starting now, all these big employers, Google neurodiversity at work, and there's hundreds of people from SAP to Microsoft to Google to Ford Motor Company to Home Depot to Rite Aid and CVS, all these different kinds of companies, all doing neurodiversity at work. And one of the things they're doing is they're looking at their neurodivergent people and they're saying, okay, she's got this incredible ability to do this. He's got this incredible ability to do that. And in many cases, those people aren't college graduates, or maybe they're not graduates of the program that they use in their field where they excel. And they're saying, what's wrong with this picture? I want schools to send me people like them who are qualified. And so we've got to move from teaching to the test to teaching the real world skill to be an engineer or be a copywriter or be a physical fitness teacher or be any of the million other things you can do when you leave college. And of course, the same thing applies to the staff in college. What matters is how you do your job, not how you pass a test.
So this is kind of related to this next question before we go to Q&A, and it's kind of a hybrid of a question in the Q&A and a question that we had. And it's really about advocacy, self-advocacy and other advocacy. So what is the best way to interrupt microaggressions or passive exclusion for neurodiverse people? And how can we be allies? That's for neurotypical people. But then, you know, many of the questions that we're seeing in the chat are, and how do neurodiverse people self-advocate? So two parts.
I think that we have to learn to speak up for ourselves, and the people we speak to have to learn to be more accommodating. There are many, many examples where human behavior is governed by how we behaved on the plains and in the jungles, whether that was Ice Age Europe or the African savanna. So for example, if I come up and get right up in your face and you feel threatened, that's because tens of thousands of years ago, when our ancestors were faced with that situation, the next likely move was a murderous attack.
Mm-hmm.
And so you hear something unexpected and you have an instinctive response of hard rejection. And yet we live in a world that is in many ways much less threatening. The chance that when somebody gets in your face and says something, or the chance that somebody says something outlandish and rude is going to lead to a life-threatening attack on you, that's really, really small today.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now at a point in our society where our responses could be said to be out of proportion to the insult offered. And yet they're hardwired in us. So it's hard for us to learn to be more accepting, but we have to be more accepting. We have to give people a chance. You know, when I was being interviewed years ago, and a writer from a magazine, he said, okay, well, if this autism thing causes people to just say and do inappropriate things, how do I tell the difference between a nice guy with autism and a common jerk?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought at first he's put me on, but I realized it's a serious question. And I think the answer is that if a common jerk says something and you turn around and you run off in tears, the jerk turns to his friend and they start snickering. If the same thing happens, but the guy's autistic and you run off, the autistic guy turns around and he shakes his head and says, what did I do? What did I say to her? What's the matter? Because he has no clue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the difference is one person says a thing to you to be malicious.
Mm-hmm.
Another person says a thing to you because it's the best thing he can think at the moment, because he sees the world differently than you, and because you're seeing a different thing than him, you took great offense, but he never meant the offense. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to ask yourself, might that person be seeing things from a different perspective? But I think that's a thing that we need to do. And as an institution of higher learning, universities should be the first places to master that, because as a university, one could say it's the school's job to teach the broader public. It's the school's job to teach tomorrow's adult leaders. And that becomes a value. Just as in the 1960s, you said in school that we're going to teach racial equality, we're going to teach civil rights, we're going to teach not only grudging acceptance, we're going to teach how the world is better with fully enthusiastic acceptance. So those ideas have to be translated today into this world.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think it's a big challenge for schools for tomorrow. And it's going to start by embracing the staff.
Okay.
And making
Great.
the staff feel comfortable.
Great. Okay. And faculty, employees.
Right. I mean, everyone.
Yeah. Right.
At the school. Yes.
So, UNT has a world-class College of Music. And I don't know if this is coming from a College of Music student, but the question is, were you trained musically? Could you speak to advantages and disadvantages you encountered as a music student or that neurodivergent students might experience? Music pedagogy settings involve a lot of social aspects.
So that's an interesting question. And I see there are a few other questions in the chat, which I can try and answer. I was not formally trained in anything beyond the 9th grade. But I think that it would be disingenuous to suggest that I am uneducated. My ability to read and to teach myself things has always been pretty powerful. In the case of music, I never composed or played music. I engineered equipment to make it sound better and to produce music. The screen is frozen. Are you still okay? Well, you might not be. Hopefully people can still hear me. She's translating me, so I can see that. Okay. Anyway, in music, I was self-educated when I worked in music, and I left producing and engineering music in the late 1980s. And in the early 1990s, I took up photography, and I still today photograph musicians and performing artists. If you go to facebook.com/John Elder Robeson, that's my public figure Facebook page, and then Facebook/John.Robeson is the personal page. If you go to the public figure page and look at the photo albums, you'll see hundreds or maybe even thousands of pictures of me with musicians. And I think that there's a recognizable style to those images that I would credit in part with autism. And one thing that is striking to me is when I photograph performers at these events, a lot of times I talk to them before the shows. And, you can see in my photographs that I'm right up, right up next to them doing this. They will say to me, hey, you've got to meet our keyboard player. He's got Asperger's. You've got to meet, our drummers, got ADHD, or our sax player got a daughter with just diagnosed with autism. They just read one of your books. And so I find that my writing and speaking on neurodiversity has preceded me. And it's like every stage I step onto, there are musicians, engineers, producers who are neurodivergent. The most common thing I see is autism and ADHD, and it's just like it's on every stage. I don't know that any of us knew about neurodiversity before the modern era, but there's so many older people now who are learning about their own neurodiversity because of their kids being diagnosed, sometimes even grandkids. So somebody else asked me the timing about the therapist sharing the information in the book is interesting, and do I wish this would have happened 10 or 20 years earlier? Sometimes I wish that I had known why I was different as a child, because it would have maybe remediated some of the pain and the loneliness that I felt. But at the same time, there is a downside to early diagnosis, and that is lowered expectations. Kids who are diagnosed with autism are often kind of described in hushed tones as those kids aren't college material, or maybe those kids will go to community college, but these other people will go to university. And I think that by setting lower expectations, the outcome for those kids is not as good. For me, because I had good language skills, the teacher said, oh, you're so bright, you could do any of this. You're just lazy, you're just defiant, you're just oppositional. And they never expected less of me. And I guess I think looking back that that's a good thing. So could I have benefited from knowledge to make me feel better and to be empowered by knowledge? Absolutely. But I'm scared of how stigmas of medical diagnoses hold back or limit progress of young people today. The same person asked if anyone in my life saw neurodiversity before I could see it. You know, in the 1960s and 70s, neurodiversity simply wasn't a thing. I think that they could see that I was different, but none of us had a word for why. And I guess that's the best I can answer. Somebody asked at the beginning of the questions, is neurodiversity damage or evolution? There is very, very strong evidence that some of the genetic differences that we associate, especially with autism and ADHD, that some of those differences actually can be traced not only back through the human ancestors, but some of them are also present in our ape and our ape cousins today. So that suggests that certain traits that we would call socially disabling, but possibly also gifting, that those traits evolved before we became human. And that's a long, long time ago. Now, having said that, you've probably all heard about brain injury from lead poisoning, brain injury from mercury poisoning, traumatic brain injury following high fevers, and even maternal fevers and maternal illness. Those are all very real causes of brain damage. Brain damage can cause us to have different neurological function. I think a person who's brain damaged is a little different from someone who was born different. But one important way that they are not different is a person who has an injured or damaged brain is still a 100% complete correct human, just as a person who has an injured leg or a crippled back is a complete human. All humans are entitled to the same human rights and respect, regardless of how their body functions, how their brain functions, what their skin looks like, what faith they follow. We are all entitled to the same rights. So I think that when you ask a question, is this damage or evolution, we have to be very careful that we are not stepping onto a path to discrimination and marginalization. Obviously, people are different for different reasons. Some evolved, some acquired.
So Shani is having some computer difficulties, and she asked me to step in and moderate Mr. Robison's. You're doing a great job on your own, but was the next question you were going to answer? Which accomplishments are you most proud of?
Can we email you after this panel? Yes, you can. You can go to William and Mary, wm.edu/neurodiversity. And if you just go to the college website, on neurodiversity is a thing that says about John Elder Robison, and you can contact me there. And I'm in the college email directory. I am also the advisor to Center for Neurodiversity at Landmark College in Putney, Vermont. And you can look me up there, landmark.edu and neurodiversity. So yes, you can write me through those. Brendan asked what accomplishments I'm most proud of. I guess that I've been very lucky in my life that I have had a number of things I'm proud to have done. I'm proud of what I worked on in music and in toys, and I'm proud of circuit designs that I did as a military contractor for government agencies. One thing I'm proud of is that I designed signal processing equipment for the US national labs, Livermore, Los Alamos, Sandia, back in the 1980s and 1990s. And today, I am the neurodiversity advisor for the Livermore Lab. And I'm proud to continue that service. I'm proud of my service to the autism community, serving 10 years on advisory boards for the National Institutes of Health, culminating in serving 9 years on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which produces a strategic plan for autism for our country. I'm proud of being able to go out and speak to people like you all, and to spread what I hope is a message of empowerment. And I'm proud of some of the autistic artworks that we create in our car shop, or in photos that go out and win shows. I guess I'm proud of all those things. I don't know that I have a single favorite. Let's see. Maria says, I find it interesting that you ran your own business. I still do. You can find me online at www.robesonservice.com. As a person with ADHD, I temper my ambition and don't pursue leadership. I would have to say that I did not pursue leadership. What I pursued was independence. The reason I started a business was that I didn't understand the social dynamics of a workplace with a bunch of people. And I felt that if I didn't have the social skills to navigate a workplace, who would care about social skills under the hood of a car? And in a sense, I was right. And Temple Grandin, to use her as an example again, is the same way. Temple didn't understand the dynamics of complex, big workplaces, but Temple absolutely understood animals, and she was able to go back and work by herself in an office and design animal handling systems that worked. So both of us evolved self-employment because it matched our skills, not because we saw ourselves as leaders. So let's see, we have a question from Jacqueline. The question reads, job candidate applies to students too. If my neurodiverse student does not file paperwork, I feel limited in how much I can provide. So yes, we have this ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have requirements that schools and workplaces provide reasonable accommodations to people for disabilities. And we also have requirements that schools and workplaces extend consideration of disabilities in the workplace. But an important caveat, which she points out, is that those rules only apply if you, the person, reveal your disability and ask for accommodation. So if you get into trouble because you said something wildly inappropriate while working in the cafeteria, whether that's as a person with a job or whether it's a student worker or a university worker, if you get threatened with, with disciplinary action over that, you can't say, oh, well, I'm autistic, you owe me accommodation. Instead, if you want to be protected, you have to say, look, I'm autistic and I don't have a lot of social skills. Sometimes I say inappropriate things. And at that point, it's on the employer, and they might say, well, John, I don't know if we should put you in that job. Maybe this job would be a better fit. What do you think? But the accommodation has to happen before the incident, and it has to be requested by revealing the disability. It's not incumbent on the employer to discover the disability on their own.
John, I'm back. I'm sorry to everyone. I completely lost internet. And I just want to be mindful of time because I know you mentioned accommodations.
Yeah.
And Eve Shatine Bell and Kate Van Zays are actually going to talk a little bit about the policies here at UNT. So how about we turn it over to them, and then maybe you can follow up to their presentation with
good.
any additional comments. Great.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. May I have permission to share my screen, please? Thank you. Okay, is that working? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody?
Yes, it's working.
No? Thanks, Kate. Okay, so my name is Eve Shatteen Bell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the ADA coordinator here at UNT. And I'm just going to speak very briefly about the ADA and its requirements as it relates to disability accommodations for employees. And then Kate will get into more of the nitty gritty of what you probably actually want to know. So as you know, ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act. It is a federal law that prohibits unlawful discrimination in employment. And it actually prohibits unlawful discrimination at all steps of the hiring process, including applicant intake, application process, determining whom to interview, what questions will be asked of the candidates, and what constitutes appropriate qualifications for a position, as well as what would be the appropriate accommodations. So under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job, to the work environment, or even to the way things are usually done during the hiring process. These modifications enable individuals with disabilities to have an equal opportunity, not only to get a job, but to successfully perform their job tasks to the same extent as people who may not be neurodivergent or may not have disabilities. Reasonable accommodations are adjustments or modifications that enable people with disabilities to perform the essential functions of a job, both efficiently and productively. In this way, they're important retention and advancement tools. Reasonable accommodations may also be necessary to assist a person with a disability to apply for and/or interview for a job. Accommodations can vary depending on the nature of the job and the needs of the individual applicant or employee. Not all people with disabilities, or even all people with the same disability, will require the same accommodation or any accommodation whatsoever. The ADA requires reasonable accommodations as they relate to three aspects of employment: ensuring equal opportunity in the application process, enabling a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job, and making it possible for the employee to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. So those are the purposes of accommodations. So what are some examples of ADA accommodations? Physical changes to the structures, such as installing a ramp or modifying a restroom. Modifying the layout of a workspace is something that may be more applicable to neurodivergent individuals as opposed to mobility impaired individuals. Accessible and assistive technologies. Examples of that would be ensuring that computer software is accessible, providing screen reader software, or using video chat to facilitate communication with hard of hearing colleagues. Also providing sign language interpreters, as we are doing today, or closed captioning at meetings and events, and making materials available in Braille or large print or whatever format the individual or employee with a disability needs. And then there are also policy enhancements. An example would be modifying a policy to allow a service animal in a business setting, or adjusting work schedules so that employees with chronic medical conditions can go to medical appointments and complete their work at alternate times or locations. So how do we request accommodations if we need them? To request an accommodation, you don't need to use any kind of medical terminology or explain your disability or condition initially. You can just use quote unquote plain English. You can ask for a workplace adjustment without specifically referring to the ADA or using the words accommodation or reasonable accommodation. You should specify that the request is related to a disability, though, so that the university is on notice that you are making a request that is disability related and therefore required by law potentially, as opposed to just a preference. You can ask a third party to request the accommodation on your behalf, whether it be your physician, your vocational rehab counselor, job coach, etc. So what are the requirements of the university in terms of making reasonable accommodations when they have been requested by employees? Generally, an employer doesn't have to provide a reasonable accommodation unless an individual with a disability has asked for one. And I think Mr. Robeson referred to this. You can't expect the accommodation unless you have requested it. Once the request is made, the employer has to engage in the interactive process. And that's something that Kate will talk more about. Am I right, Kate? That's something that Kate will talk more about in a moment as soon as I'm done. Selecting an accommodation. When more than one accommodation would work, an employer can choose the one that costs less, that's easier to provide, that's less disruptive. So there's no requirement that an employee with any type of disability receive exactly the accommodation that they are requesting. Undue hardship is an important thing to talk about because an employer is only required to make reasonable accommodations to the known disability of a qualified applicant or employee if it does not pose, quote, an undue hardship on the operation of the business. An accommodation might impose an undue hardship, for example, if it requires a significant difficulty, significant expense, when it's considered in light of factors such as the employer's size, the employer's financial resources, including, system-related resources, and the nature and structure of the university's operation. An employer is not required to lower any quality or production standards to make accommodations. Employees are expected to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations. And that's my time, and I will turn it over to Kate.
Thank you, Eve. So as Eve mentioned, I just want to talk through a little bit about the process for requesting an accommodation for employees at the university. And I'm actually going to post some links and resources in the chat box as well, so that you have that information. But anybody who would like to request an accommodation, the links to the request for disability accommodation employment form and then the medical practitioner certification form, I've put the links to those in the chat box, so you can have those available to you. So anytime, like Eve said, you don't have to know specifically perhaps what the accommodation you would need immediately, but just that you may need an accommodation in order to be able to perform the essential functions of your job. And so you can reach out to HR if you just want to make an inquiry, first of all, if you're not sure what to do. Each unit at the university has an HR representative, and if you're not sure who that is, you can contact our HR administration email or our phone number that's been provided in the chat as well, and reach out to us, and then we can have a conversation to talk through the process. And when we are engaging in the interactive process after an employee has submitted a request, We will need the medical certification form as well. And then we would work in HR to talk with the employee and then separately with the supervisor to consider what accommodations may be necessary in order to, again, assist the employee with performing the essential functions of their job. And then we would come together with the supervisor and the employee at the end of the process once we've made a determination about what accommodations may be the best for that particular situation. And then we will finalize the whole process in an accommodation approval letter that will go out to the supervisor and the employee. And accommodations, once implemented, can always be reviewed if there's something that's not working, or if perhaps we need to consider some other accommodation. We often use the Job Accommodation Network or askjan.org as a resource when employees may not know exactly what accommodation may be helpful to them, because JAN can be very helpful for those purposes, but also working with your medical provider should also help you determine what accommodation may be helpful for you to be able to perform the essential functions of your job. And HR will definitely help you work through that process, but ultimately we can't decide what accommodation would be best for you. So in working with your medical provider and looking at resources such as JAN, askjan.org may be helpful in determining what that accommodation may be that you need to have put in place. And like I said, we also have a website on our UNT system page with some more information about ADA, which I've included in the chat box as well. And if you have any questions or are not sure how to start the process or what to do, please feel free to contact HR, and we are more than happy to talk to employees on a one-on-one basis. You don't have to start with your supervisor if you're not comfortable or not sure what to do. You can always reach out to HR and we'll help to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much to Kate and to Eve for sharing that information. While I have you here, there's a question in Q&A that might be appropriate for you all. Do you expect the interview process and questions to evolve to better identify the strengths of neurodiverse candidates?
I think that interview questions can absolutely be refined to identify the strengths of individuals with multiple differences and learning differences. I think that, if that is a desire of a particular search committee, I recommend that they reach out to the Office of Equal Opportunity for some guidance on how to craft particular questions. But I certainly hope that will occur, and we're happy to help it occur at the university.
Great. Okay. I don't see any other questions that maybe would be related to you all. John, I'm gonna turn your, or can you turn your video back on, and perhaps we can answer.
Not me.
Oh, I know, but I think you have to turn it back on or ask to start video. There you go.
Okay. Right.
There you go. So do you have any thoughts or follow-up to what was shared by Eve and Kate before we proceed? And what I would want to know is, they talked a lot about the broader accommodations, but what do you see as some common accommodations specifically for people who are neurodivergent?
Well, I have a common accommodations. Common accommodations would be time on tests. Accommodations would be work remotely or work in a quiet place. Engage people via computer chat instead of face-to-face conversation. If, for example, I have trouble with social dynamics because I can't read body language, if we are communicating on a chat platform, we are equal, me and someone who does not have that disability. So those would be common accommodation requests. I think that asking for work assignments that play to my strengths and not my weaknesses is a very reasonable accommodation, assuming I can, cite strengths that are relevant to the job I have. I think that otherwise accommodations are often in the realm of relieving annoyances and sources of stress. Noisy fans, flickering lights, hard walls, hard floors, glaring light. Those are, again, all things that everyone would benefit from remediating. I said, earlier that I'm, the advisor, I'm a neurodiversity advisor for the Livermore Lab, which is a campus, about 10,000 people in Livermore, California. And it's really obvious out there that every accommodation that you can see that a person asks, my cubicle's too small, the ceiling's too low, the light's not right, it's impossible for me to do this meeting and this schedule, all those things. Everybody else says, yeah, I'd like that better too. And the difference is just that for us, they're intolerable. For other people, they're irritating. But nobody likes them. And I think Bree has a question that I would like to speak to. How do we get beyond the need to prove our difference in order to receive accommodation? And I would say that is a fundamentally wrong idea. And it is based in most recently in a history of racism, where you could be, and not just racism, anti-Semitism. You could be quarter Jewish, eighth Black, whatever, and you were this fractional amount of a group that was defined as not good. And that would mean that you were not qualified for a job, or you were not even qualified to live based on that. And so when we say, prove you have ADHD, prove you're autistic, how's that different from proving racial purity? How's it different from proving you're a Catholic and not a forbidden Jew? I would argue that it isn't different. You can come up with some fancy rationalization for how it's different, but to us in the community, let me assure you, it is not. Now, does that mean that having an official diagnosis doesn't have value? Of course not. I'm not suggesting that. Having a diagnosis can be incredibly valuable and life-changing. Should you have to prove it? No, you shouldn't. Do we ask somebody when they're standing in a line at the hospital to prove they have cancer to get in front of us in the line? Do we ask somebody in a wheelchair crossing a street to prove they can't walk? No, we don't do those things. Nor should you say, prove you have autism, prove you have this or that. The fact is, if we're trying to accommodate things that disable people and make people uncomfortable, it should be more than enough for you to say, that makes me uncomfortable, so please change it. How's that any different from any other program of inclusion and acceptance we've had throughout history?
Can I pose the question that Bria had? And this is about disability as a terminology, the stigma associated with the term disability. Sometimes we'll say that.
Shani, could you read the question? It was actually such a great question.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay,
do you find the term disability as stigmatizing as the medical terminology and labels? When I use the term differences or neurodivergent people, when I use the term differences or neurodivergent, people don't understand what I mean, because disability is still a standard term to use in society and academia.
Okay, so to that, and that is, that's a good question. I didn't see that when I started answering the first one. I used an example of that when we were talking before. I said, when you say my daughter got diagnosed with autism, somebody says, I'm so sorry. And when you say I have a neurodivergent son going to college next year, they say, what's that? And so clearly one has a stigma and the other doesn't. I think that they are used in different contexts. I think when you go into, a support office at the university and you say, I'd like to request an accommodation in my work environment, or I'd like to request accommodation in my class environment, assuming you're either a worker at the university or you were a student at the university. And then you can say, well, I'm part of the neurodivergent community here. I have a neurological difference, and part of my difference is that I'm easily disabled by loud sounds. I have a high sensitivity to sound, and it just like gets on my nerves, and it makes me crazy. And the place that you've got me working is very, very hard for me. And I'd either like you to agree to have me work with noise canceling headsets, but I might not be able to hear somebody next to me, or I'd like you to maybe put me in a different place where it'll be quieter. So there we've disclosed that there's a thing about us that's disabling, and we've disclosed what the disability is. We don't have to give a medical name. I am sensitive to loud sounds, and it makes me crazy. And this is what I would like done about that. I believe that should be enough. That it's no different than many, many other accommodation situations which are required to be accommodated by law.
Okay, great.
We don't have to demean ourselves to be accommodated.
Well, we are getting close to the end. I want to thank you so much, Mr. Robeson, for being here, and let folks that are here with us know that the recording for this will be on the Division of Institutional Equity and Diversity's YouTube page. And Linda Holloway dropped in the chat information about UNT's Neurodiversity Professional Network. It is a wonderful opportunity to connect with other neurodivergent employees at UNT. And I will say, speaking from the I perspective, it has been wonderful to find a community of other employees who know more about this than I do, because they're further along in their neurodivergent identity development process. So please do join us, and the information, the video will be available for viewing. Also, several people have asked if they can contact you, Mr. Robeson. How can people find you?
I told people they can go to either William and Mary /neurodiversity or Landmark College /neurodiversity. The direct email address they can write down is jerobeson@wm.edu. And they can also find me on Facebook, John.Robeson on Facebook. I'm at John Robeson on Twitter, and I'm John Elder Robeson on LinkedIn.
There you go.
I have an Instagram, but I'm not really active on it yet, so I suggest you not seek me out there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us here today, and come visit us again.